Well, good morning. Welcome to New Life. Thanks for choosing to spend part of your Sunday morning with us here. We appreciate it very much. Grateful to have you here. So I'm going to give you some insider information, this insider trading. Last year, on the Sunday after Easter, I had Steve deliver the message, and I remember thinking as I was sitting there listening to Steve how badly I felt for him, because the Sunday after Easter is like the worst energy of any Sunday that ever exists on the planet. It's like we had Easter, we're like, yes, Jesus is alive, and then the week after you're like, all right, okay. But like the reality is, right, and so again, this insider information, like Jesus is still alive today. So it's still good. Like we can have a little energy, a little back and forth here this morning. We can try at least. We'll try to work on it. You don't need a clap or anything, but just remember, if you guys are flat, it's going to feel really bad up here. All right. All right, so we're picking up in the middle of our very long series of messages, the Jesus Project. We took a little intermission last Sunday for the Jesus Project for our Easter Sunday message. This morning we pick back up, and so I'm going to kind of recap where we've been, just kind of let you kind of remind ourselves kind of where we were, so that when we get into this morning, it starts to try to make some sense. So where we've been over the last several weeks, we've been sort of at kind of the high point of the Gospels as we have them written, at least for Matthew and Mark particularly. Matthew and Mark have already given us about 2/3 of their Gospel. We've already gone through 2/3 of Matthew and Mark. Luke and John are very different. Luke's telling a little bit slightly different story. We'll talk about him in a minute. John, as I've said before, problem child. He's got a lot of stuff that doesn't fit inside of the narrative of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and so we're trying to kind of put all of the pieces together. But we're about 2/3 of the way through the story, and really the way Matthew and Mark tell the story is it's like this first section of Jesus out in Galilee. He's preaching, he's teaching, he's healing people, doing these miraculous signs, having some sort of confrontations at different points with the religious leaders. But then it moves to this place where the disciples have this realization of who Jesus is. And it comes in the form of Peter's confession. Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." We saw that was maybe a month or 5 or 6 weeks ago, somewhere around there. And then immediately after that, Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up onto the mountain. He's transfigured in front of them. They see like heaven is coming to earth. This is their vision of Jesus in all of his glory and in all of his power. And then from that moment on, the narrative starts to turn from all of this stuff that's happening inside of Galilee and starts to move downhill towards Jerusalem, starts to move down to the place that's going to bring the Jesus story to its conclusion. There's a sort of transitional zone inside of the story. And what we recognize, right, is that every story has those transitional moments inside of them. And what we see in those transitional moments is sort of all of the things that we saw in the early stages and early phases of a story. Those themes and those ideas start to develop a little bit further, but they're also setting the stage for what's going to happen later on inside the story. So every good story that you've loved, your life story, whether you like it or not, whether you love it or not, it's had those transitional moments. Every story, every film, every novel you've ever read has these sort of set pieces where it's like, okay, we're moving from one series of events into another series of events, and we're carrying on some themes that we've seen, but we're also starting to make way for something bigger that's going to come after it. And what we're entering into in the gospel story, in the Jesus Project story, is a really long transitional stage where a lot of the things that we've seen Jesus say and do, we're going to hear some of those themes develop themselves a little bit further, but we're also going to hear Jesus start to sound some new themes and some new ideas as he starts moving himself down towards Jerusalem. Like I said, we've gotten 2/3 of the way through Matthew and Mark. Luke, in his telling of the Jesus story, has a really long transitional phase. He tells a lot of stories about Jesus that Matthew and Mark don't tell. He has a lot of sort of unique material. In fact, some of the more famous Jesus' parables are found in this transitional time from when Luke starts moving his story from Galilee and sort of backwoods kind of area down towards Jerusalem. And so for the next several months, we're actually going to spend most of the next several months inside of Luke's gospel. Before we get there, we're going to tell one last sort of piece that weaves together. We're going to be in Matthew, Mark, and Luke today. They all tell somewhat of a similar story. There's a lot of common overlap theme like we find in the three gospels as usual. Matthew, as usual, has his own little twist on things at the beginning. Luke has his own little twist on things at the end. And so we're going to be in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all kind of in this transitional piece as Jesus starts heading down from Galilee into the city of Jerusalem, into the capital city where his life eventually will kind of come to its conclusion. Not the end like we talked about last week, but an end of the story. And so here's how Matthew picks up in Matthew chapter 17, verse 24. It says, "When they came to Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma tax went up to Peter and said, 'Does your teacher not pay the tax?' And he said, 'Yes.' And when he came into the house, Jesus spoke to him first, saying, 'What do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth take the toll or their tax? From their sons or from others?' And when he said, 'From others,' Jesus said to him, 'Then the sons are free. However, not to give offense to them, go to the sea, cast a hook, and take the first fish that comes up. And when you open its mouth, you will find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for me and for yourself.'" Now, we don't really have much frame of reference for this, or at least most of us don't have a frame of reference for this. So we're going to kind of set the stage, a little bit of background work on what this whole story is about. Collectors of a 2 drachma tax. Anybody know what a drachma is? Anybody want to make a guess? No, I'm not going to put you on the spot, right? Essentially, it's 2 coins, 2 Greek coins that were used inside of Israel at this time to pay a tax for the support and maintenance of the temple. And what they had done was, by the time Jesus' time comes along, at this point in the Jesus story and in the story of Israel, something that was meant to be paid once at the beginning of your life is now all of a sudden paid every year. Does it sound like how taxes work? Right? Like something that was meant to be paid. So the origin of this temple tax comes from when a boy was born. He was supposed to be redeemed back from the service to the temple. They were supposed to pay for the son's life, essentially, pay the tax once to the temple, once to the tabernacle, and then from that point on, the son, the child, was to go free. He didn't have to be required to serve in and wasn't required to go back and do the things inside of the temple. That was part of their redemption price for their children and their freedom. But by the time Jesus comes along, something that was meant to be paid once is now all of a sudden they send a collector to your house. This is, again, like this human behavior, right? It sounds very, pay the tax once, and then once you get to a certain point, they're like, "Oh no, now you got to pay that tax again this year, and now you got to pay that tax again next year. We're going to pay that tax again the year after." And as you can see inside of the little story, there are some people who don't really like the idea of paying the tax every year. There's some people, there's some resistors, maybe some freedom fighters among them who say, "Hey, this was supposed to be just a one-time deal. Why is it that we keep paying taxes and you keep coming back to our house year after year for the same tax, asking us to pay to support," in their minds, a corrupt and sort of, just contentious religious and political system that they were not super thrilled with? Sound familiar? No one's feeling that one? So the collectors of the tax come to Peter outside of the house where Jesus is staying inside of Capernaum, which is sort of his home base, and they say, "Doesn't your teacher pay the tax? Doesn't he, kind of participate? Doesn't he follow the rules? Isn't he a good, Jewish law-abiding Israel citizen, person who's committed to the support and the service of the temple?" And Peter, in his way, says, "Well, yeah, of course. Of course he pays the tax. Like, he's a good person. He's a good Jew. He does all of the things that he's supposed to do." It goes inside of the house, and Peter has a conversation with Jesus, and Jesus wants to talk to him about this interaction that he had outside with the collectors of the 2 drachma tax, the temple tax. And he says, "Hey, Peter, what do you think about whether or not we're supposed to be paying this tax?" What do you think about, where do you think the kings of the earth take their taxes? And if this temple and this system is my Father's house, as I've kind of tried to establish for you already, do you think it's right for me to be paying this tax to what I think and what you think, if you're following me, is a corrupt religious and political system that has taken over and is capitalizing on the backs of the people it was supposed to serve? What do you think, Peter? Who do the kings tax when it comes time to tax? Do they go around and do they gather up their sons and say, hey, we need to build a new castle. You guys are going to pay for it. He says, no, they go out and they find all of their citizens, people like us, unless you're one of those aristocratic kind of people. I don't think there's a whole lot of those in here. They find people like us, and they build the castle, or they build the palace, or they build the wall, or they build the house, or they build the whatever it is that they're building. They build it on the backs of the people that are not the sons, not the people who belong to the house. And Jesus has spent so much time, and especially in Matthew, and this is unique to Matthew, none of the other gospel writers have this particular story. Jesus has spent so much time establishing himself as the son of David, the son of Abraham, and eventually, as Peter himself has said just a couple of verses before this, the Son of God, whose temple that actually is. Do you think I need to pay that tax? Jesus says. But so as not to give them offense, just so as not to totally mess with them. Go and find a fish. First fish that you take will have your tax and my tax in it, can pay for it. Now, interestingly, inside of this, and it's the one time in the Jesus Project story that Jesus alludes to a miracle and it doesn't happen. Matthew doesn't ever tell what happens. It doesn't say Peter went out to the lake and caught a fish and grabbed a shekel from its mouth and paid the 2 drachma tax. And I will let you decide whether you think Jesus had him pay it or not. And then we'll move on. And they came to Capernaum. And when he was in the house, he asked them, what were you discussing on the way? We'll shift scenes to Mark. Mark, Matthew, and Luke all have this little piece. Do you love how I just didn't answer that question? Some of you hate it so much. And they came to Capernaum. And when he was in that house, he asked them, what are you discussing on the way? But they kept silent because on the way they had agreed with one, they had argued with one another. They had not agreed with one another about who was the greatest. And he sat down and called the 12, and he said to them, if anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. And he took a child and put him in the midst of them, and taking him in his arms, he said to them, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me. And again, Matthew had it at the very beginning of his little story, and then Mark puts the same little tag, and they were in this place in Capernaum, which has been Jesus' home base, but now will become sort of the jumping off point for the rest of the Jesus stories. He starts to move out of Galilee and move down towards Jerusalem. And there in the house, he has a discussion with his 12 disciples who have been on their way arguing about this question that seems to consume them, that seems to be so important to them. Which one of us is the greatest of Jesus' disciples? Which one of us is the best Jesus follower? Which one of us at the end of the day is Jesus, when he comes into his kingdom, going to look at and say, you get to sit on my right hand. You are my right hand man. And interestingly, right, as Jesus has established already, right? Like he said, like my kingdom is coming, my will is being done, this is what's going to happen. But he's never said somebody's going to sit on my right hand and my left hand side. He's never made out any sort of pretense about himself that there's going to be some kind of throne somewhere that he's going to sit on, and he's going to choose among these 12 which one of them is the greatest of his followers. He's never said anything like that. He's never kind of given any indication about that, but they're so concerned about it. They're so caught up with all of this stuff. They've just had this incredible moment where Peter said, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then immediately after, Jesus said, so here's what that means. The Messiah, the Christ, is going to suffer at the hands of evil people who are going to take his life. He's going to give his life as an offering and as a ransom for all of the people on the planet, including you guys. And all you can think about is which one is the greatest. All you can think about is which one of you gets the position of power, which one of you gets the position of authority. You have the right belief about me, and Mark and Matthew and Luke have spent chapters building up to this great confession about who Jesus is. It's an incredibly important confession that Peter makes. But then as soon as he makes the confession, and as soon as the other disciples hear the confession and decide that they're going to agree with this confession, Mark, Matthew, and Luke all start to say, okay, that's great. You've got some good information about Jesus. But now we've got to deal with your bigger problem, which is you may have the right information about Jesus, but you don't know what to do with it. You might be able to say, this is the truth about who Jesus is. And as Christians, people trying to follow Jesus, it's incredibly important for us to be able to accurately identify who Jesus is and what we mean by Jesus as the Christ, the Son of the living God. It is also incredibly important that we learn how to live in relationship with each other in such a way that reflects what we believe to be true. And for the rest of the Gospels, we're going to find that the disciples have good information about Jesus, and then they've got really bad ideas about how to live it out. Because they think, weirdly enough, that serving a person and following a person who's going to give his life as a service for the entirety of humanity, they think that the way to embody the mission of Jesus is then to get in an argument with each other about which one of them is best. And Jesus says, hey, I need you to understand that inside of this community, as you're trying to follow me, as you're trying to live out this mission, as you're trying to live out the things that you say you believe to be true, if you want to be first, you have to be willing to be last. Because in the Jesus kingdom, in the Jesus community, to be first is to be last. It's to place others above yourself. It's to not argue with each other about which of you is better, which of you is more important, which of you is more significant. Let's leave some of that aside. Let's put that nonsense off to the side over here. And instead, let's embrace this idea that to follow Jesus is to humble yourself. It's to be willing to be servant of every single person inside of your life and inside of your community. It's to not look at anyone else in service to your agenda. It's to look at everyone else as an opportunity for you to show the way that Jesus loves, cares, and shows concern and compassion for other people. Every single person in your life, including the least and the least significant person that you know, is an opportunity for you to embody the mission of Jesus. That's why he takes a child, the person with the least social status, power, and significance in the room, places them, and it was likely one of their own children that he takes and puts in front of them, right? Like, because they're in their house. So imagine, because this is how we tend to think about ourselves, right? If you're the parent, you're the person in power. You're the person with authority. You're the person who tells what to do and what not to do. And then they do whatever they want to do, but that's a different story. But you're the person, right? You're the man. You're the first. You're the top dog. You're the person who gets to make the rules. And Jesus takes one of their own children, places them in the midst, and says, now, this person to you looks like the least. This person to you looks like the one without significance, without power. This is the person who just does what they're supposed to do. I want you to understand. If you want to be first in my kingdom, you got to become like this person. Least. Less significant, less important to yourself, and maybe less important in the eyes of others, because following Jesus is not about elevating ourselves. It's about humbling ourselves, living a life of service to other people, in community with other people that would embody the same kind of life that Jesus himself lived. Then they go on from the house, and you'll find a theme begins to develop. John said to him, "Teacher, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he was not following us." Time out, John. Did you miss the conversation we just had? Obviously. But Jesus said, "Do not stop him, for no one who does a mighty work in my name will be able soon afterwards to speak evil of me. For the one who is not against us is for us. For truly I say to you, whoever gives you a cup of water to drink because you belong to Christ will by no means lose his reward." They go on, and again, John and the other guys their eyes are out here. We're looking at someone else. This guy over here, he's not following with us. He's not in this group. He's not part of the elite 12. He's not part of the group that gets to, hang out with Jesus. And he's over here doing his own thing, but he's doing it in your name. And Jesus says, stop worrying about him. Essentially, this is my translation of what Jesus says. Stop worrying about everybody else. Stop paying attention to what everybody else is doing, what everybody else is not doing. Stop trying to make yourselves feel superior to everybody else because you happen to be one of the 12 that I chose. And it's almost as if, and I don't know if Jesus would say this, but it's almost as if Jesus would say, I could have picked 12 guys, different guys. I didn't have to choose you. You're not special. You're not like this great, powerful person because I chose you. You're just John. Upset because some guy over here is doing something good for someone else, is doing the same kinds of things that I've been doing it, is doing it in my name, is doing it to serve the good of some other human being, and you are too concerned about whether or not he's got the right credentials, whether or not he's doing it the right way, and whether or not he is inferior or superior to you. And Jesus seems to say, I think, look, pay attention to someone's sincerity because their sincerity will supersede that feeling of superiority that we tend to like. Don't we like that? We like to look around at other people and be like, I'm a little better than you. I'm not Jesus level, but I got a leg up on you because I don't know if you know this, but I'm one of the 12 who is following with Jesus. And you over there, sir, you were not quite, you didn't make the cut. Let's just be honest. And can I just say, right, unfortunately, isn't this sometimes what Christians are known for? Is that slightly, maybe not so slightly, superior attitude towards other people? Isn't this weird? Even inside of our own churches and inside of our own communities, where it's like, well, we've got, this person, he's a little bit better than you, and you're a little bit better than her, and, but this one's down at the bottom. And Jesus is trying to say, look, why are we paying attention to this stuff? Why don't we pay attention to someone's sincerity and their desire to pursue after me and to follow me? Why don't we pay attention to that? Why don't we pay attention to actually finding the people who are willing to do even the least significant thing, like give a cup of water away to someone who's thirsty and not ask for any praise or any recognition in return? Why don't we start paying attention to those people rather than the other people who step up here and say, well, I just want you to know, I'm the leader and you guys are just the followers? Why don't we pay attention? People who willingly give themselves away in service to other people. You know why? Because we don't like that. That human piece of us just likes to feel superior to other people. And Jesus is saying, in my communities, my people, we're not going to live like that. The first are going to act like the last. The ones who want to lead are going to act like servants of everyone else. And here's how he continues it. So whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a great millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the sea. And if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It's better for you to enter life crippled than with 2 hands to go to hell, to the unquenchable fire. And if your foot causes you to sin, cut it off, for it's better for you to enter life lame than with 2 feet to be thrown into hell. And if your eye causes you to sin, tear it out, for it's better for you to enter the kingdom of God with 1 eye than with 2 to be thrown into hell, where their worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. For everyone will be salted with fire. Salt is good, we've heard this one before, but if the salt has lost its saltiness, how will you make it salty again? Have salt in yourselves. I love this because I love salt. And be at peace with one another. We get this whole long passage. It's, there's a lot going on in this. Don't have time necessarily to take all of those pieces apart, but I just want you to pay attention to the first part, and I want you to pay attention to the last part. Whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it's better that you would throw a millstone around your neck and toss yourself into the sea than to not care for one of these little ones who believe in me. And now, I think a lot of times we take that to refer to those little children that were in the midst of Jesus' community. But I think we should understand that Jesus is using those little ones as an illustration for all of his followers. He's not just talking about if you cause a child to sin, if you cause a child to offend, that it's better. He's talking about you guys take care of each other in such a way that you recognize that you have a responsibility to live at peace with each other. At the end of the day, what he says, here's what I'm trying to get you to understand. Let's not focus so much on where everybody else is, what everybody else is doing. I want you instead to have the ability to live at peace with each other. Live in such a way that you put other people ahead of yourself. We'll hear this over and over again as we move through this transitional phase. We'll hear some variation of the theme, love your neighbor as yourself. So many times you're going to get sick and tired of hearing it. Because love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, that's easy. God is God. He's really good. Your neighbor, the person sitting next to you, your spouse sometimes, your kids sometimes, your boss, the person that sits in the cube next to you, whoever it is, they're not always so good. Be at peace with one another. Live in such a way that you recognize that how we behave is as important as what we believe. We, for years and years and years, I think Christians have gotten this so turned around. The only thing that matters is whether or not you believe correctly. Can you say the creed? If you can say the creed and you can say this is what you believe and you can do it without asking any questions because your catechism class told you you weren't supposed to ask any questions, if you can recite the confession of faith that your Sunday school teacher gave you, your pastor gave you, if you can say the right words about what you believe, that's enough. Jesus has no place or tolerance for that. It's not just what you believe. It's how you behave because of what you believe. It's how you treat other people because of what you believe is true about Jesus. Because if you believe what you believe about Jesus, then what you believe is that the person who had all the power, had all the authority, had all of the glory, gave all of that up, set all of that aside to serve you and to serve me. And if that's what you believe is true about Jesus, then how you behave in response to that is to live in such a way that you place priority on other people. You live at peace with one another. As much as is possible within you, Paul will say it later. As much as it is in you to live at peace with some other human being, particularly inside this Jesus-following community, you do it. That means you let go of offenses sometimes. That means you let go of things that you've kind of held on to. You let go of grudges. I'm Irish, believe me, I feel that. You let go of it sometimes. And instead you choose to treat other people with the kind of compassion and love and concern that Jesus himself showed to you. How we behave is as important as what we believe. Well, we got one more. This is Luke's unique contribution, and once again, we don't get it. All right. When the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. This is Luke's unique way of saying, here's where we are going for the next several chapters, actually. So you got a nice long run of Luke stories that's going to follow this. And it's a very defined way of Luke saying inside of his story, because his early gospel is actually relatively short. His Galilee portion is really short. But this extended transition time, he says, this is what Jesus understood. That it was time for him to leave Galilee, leave Capernaum, leave that village area, all that place that he'd been traveling around, doing all the things he's been doing. And it's time for him to move towards Jerusalem, where he's about to make his exodus, make his departure. And he sent messengers ahead of him who went and entered a village of the Samaritans to make preparations for him. But the people did not receive him because his face was set toward Jerusalem. And when his disciples, James and John, saw it, they said, Lord, let's go serve them a cup of water in your name. Right? Let's go treat them with kindness and with compassion. Nope. James and John saw it. They said, Lord, how about we tell fire to come down from heaven and consume them? I know, we felt it. We've all felt it sometimes. But he turned and rebuked them, and they went on to another village. I love, Peter he gets such a bad rap, right? Doesn't he? Everybody loves to abuse Peter for all the times that he makes, just says nonsense things, just ridiculous things sometimes. But here's James and John, right? Let's call down fire on this village because they didn't want to receive you. So I think if Peter's going to get a bad rap, James and John should get at least equally poor treatment from preachers like me, because at the end of the day, he's just said how we behave is as important as what we believe. How can we live at peace with one another? How can we treat the least as those who are the greatest? How can we make ourselves the servants of everyone? And James and John are like, how about we call down fire from heaven to consume these people because they don't love you enough? So ridiculous. And again, it's what we'll see. And again, I think this is some of Luke's way of setting the stage. Hey, look, things are in motion here, but I want you to understand that as we're moving towards this conclusion, and as Jesus moves towards the conclusion of his time with his disciples, he's trying, I think, so hard to make sure that they understand that at the heart of his movement is not a set of beliefs. At the heart of his movement is this embodying of a kingdom way of living that says, this is how I live because I believe that the person who is my king gave himself away for the good of the world. And so because the one that I call my king gave himself away for the good of the world, I will live in such a way that I would give myself graciously and fully for the good of other people around me. I'm not going to live, in other words, it seems like such a baseline way to live. I'm not going to live as the kind of Jesus following person who goes around wishing that God would call down fire on people. Can we just agree, can we just agree that living as a Jesus following person would be much better if we stopped wishing God would just call down fire on a bunch of people? Whatever the group is. You know your group that you wish, rain down fire on them, and not in a good way, Lord. Let them get what they deserve, God. I've heard people pray like that. Literally. You have too, if you've been in church long enough. Jesus has no place for that. Instead, what he says is, let's not exercise authority. Instead, let's live as people who extend grace. Wouldn't it be better? Can you imagine? Can you imagine how people would view Christians differently if our posture was an extension of His grace to every single person we met? Can you imagine if from the least to the greatest, the person that you consider the least significant to the person in your life who you know has the most power, the most significance, and the most authority, can you imagine if you looked at every person in your life and you said, this is an opportunity for me to extend Jesus' grace to people? Could you imagine if we were less caught up with making sure that we got everybody to believe exactly what they're supposed to believe and lock it all in? Because here's the thing, like none of us believe all the right things. Could you imagine if instead we were laser focused on how do we treat other human beings? How do we behave with them? How do we live at peace with other people because of what we believe is true about Jesus? What if we were less call down fire on them? And what if we were more, let's show grace to them? What if we were, let's live at peace with them? Let's live our lives in a way that embodies and embraces the posture of Jesus for the world. Can you imagine what that would look like? I don't think that people are prepared for Christians to act like that. They're prepared for us to act like James and John. Fire from heaven, Lord. Get them. Jesus says, I'm not about that. That's not what I'm here for. Instead, I'm here for you to see what it looks like to live as a person with all kinds of authority, all kinds of power, and who will use it to serve and show grace to other people. That is at the heart of the Jesus movement. And in this transition piece, and as we'll move over, through the next several months together through Luke's gospel, what we're going to find is this story is going to show up over and over again in so many different ways. Find ways to care, love, and serve other people in your lives the way that Jesus did. That is at the heart of the Jesus movement. Would you pray with me this morning? Jesus, I'm grateful that you are not the sort of person who exercised your authority. You're not the kind of person who modeled this sort of top-down, most important person in the room, takes everything from everybody else kind of life. But instead, in every room that you were in every circumstance, in every situation you found yourself, you served, you loved, and you extended grace. So Jesus, I pray for us as we seek to follow you as best as we possibly can. Would you help us to embody that way of life? Would you help us to live with others first and ourselves second? Would you help us to love our neighbors as much as we love ourselves, and maybe even more? And would you show us and allow us to show the world that kind of grace, mercy, and compassion? It's in your name that we pray. Amen.